I never knew anyone so keenly alive to a joke as the king was. He seemed always out for a good joke. To tell a good joke and to tell it well was the surest way to gain his approval. He had 7 ministers to his pleasing that were unmatchable jokers. The king enjoyed practical jokes most of all. Now the epitome of jesters were to have caps and bells with sharp witticisms at any given time. These jesters were referred to as fools. There were also dwarfs. They were just as common as jesters, and many monarchs did not live through a day without a jester to laugh with and a dwarf to laugh at. This king had both in one person. This fool's name was Hopfrog. Hopfrog claimed his name not from birth, but because in order to maneuver around, he had to leap and wriggle. Yet in spite of Hopfrog's disabilities with his lower limbs, he had complete strength in his upper body that allowed him to climb many different obstacles. Hopfrog's original country is not to be named due to its barbarousness, but the king sent for him and also a young girl less dwarfish than Hopfrog himself. Her name was Trippetta. These two prisoners became sworn friends. Trippetta used her beauty that possessed much influence towards the benefit of Hopfrog. On some grand occasion, the king planned a masquerade. Whenever a masquerade or anything of that sort occurred, then the talents of both Hopfrog and Trippetta were used. Hopfrog was so inventive in the way of creating things such as costumes, characters, or any sort of creative item. Trippetta used her talents for decorating famous balls grand. The night came for the masquerade, and everybody in the hall had wonderful costumes, everyone, that is, except the king and his 7 ministers. The king sent for Hopfrog and Trippetta for their assistances. The 2 little friends obeyed the summons and found the king and his men sitting with wine, but they were with very ill humor. The king knew good and well that Hopfrog was not fond of wine, but the king loved his practical jokes and forced Hopfrog to drink the wine. Knowing full well that Hopfrog didn't like to drink, the king told him to for his absent friends. It happened to be his birthday, and this comment made him cry. Reluctantly, he drank, as the king and the ministers laughed at him. After the prime minister directed the group to his business, the king agreed and degraded Hopfrog and Trippetta once again. This begins to anger Trippetta, and she goes to the king and tried to beg him to spare her friend. He didn't care what she thought, and shoved her and threw his wine on her. As she got up, it was dead quiet, so quiet you could hear a feather fall. The silence was broken by a noise in the background. The 8 were first dressed in their tight-fitting shorts and drawers. Next, they were covered in tar. Someone suggested feathers, but he was overruled by Hopfrog, and he persuaded the others. He said they need something more fibrous that was a thick coating on top of the tar. Now, Hopfrog brought out a chain. He first wrapped it around the king's waist and went to the minister straight across and tied it around his waist. After he did this to all of them, as far apart from each other as possible, they formed a circle. Hopfrog tried to seem as natural as possible. The masquerade was to be in the grand saloon. It's a circular room that is very lofty, with only one window. At night, the room was lit up by a chandelier. It could be lowered or elevated, and attached by a chain in the center. The decor of the room was left to Trippetta to take care of, but it seemed in some places she may have been influenced by her dwarf friend. It was his suggestion that the chandelier be removed, as its hot wax would be damaging to the guests' dresses if it dripped. The crowded room was also decorated with additional sconces for lighting and flambeaux to make the room smell sweet. Taking Hopfrog's advice, the Ourang-Outangs waited until midnight, when the room was full of masqueraders, to make their appearance. Right as midnight came, the group made their way in, their chains causing the party guests to fall and stumble as they came. The excitement of the guests filled the king's heart with glee. As expected, few of the guests thought the ugly-looking beasts were real, and women stirred with fright. The king was sure to take caution beforehand, though, and remove all weapons from the saloon. If he had not, the party may have ended in their bleeding to death. A wide rush of guests was made toward the doors, but the king also thought of this and ordered the doors to be locked immediately after their entering. The keys were entrusted to Hopfrog upon his suggestion. At the height of the excitement, each masquerader was at their own defense, as the large excited crowd was something to be quite defensive of. The chain of the chandelier, which normally hung but had been removed, may have been seen gradually descending from the ceiling until it came within 3 feet of the floor. Soon after the descending, the king and his 7 friends found themselves in the center of the room in direct contact with the chain. The dwarf, who had been following the group at their heels, noiselessly encouraged them to keep up the commotion, and discreetly took hold of their chain and crossed the circle diametrically and at right angles. With rapid thought, he inserted the hook by which the chandelier used to hang, and in an instant the chain was drawn very far up, as to take the hook out of reach, and by some odd consequence, to drag the orangutans very close together and face to face. By this time the masqueraders had recovered from their great surprise and sent a loud roar of laughter at the sight of the apes drawn together. Hop Frog, now pretending to examine the silly people in ape costumes. He managed to scramble over the heads of the crowd and reach the wall, where he picked up a flambeau and returned to the center of the room, leaping with agility of a monkey upon the king's head and finally climbing a few short feet up the chain. Holding down the torch to examine the group of orangutans, he still screamed. The whole assembly, including the apes, was in a large roar of laughter, when suddenly the jester gave a sharp whistle, and the chain flew rigorously up for almost 30 feet, taking with it the struggling orangutans, and leaving them suspended in midair. Hop Frog clung to the chain as it rose, and kept his position on it in relation to the 8 maskers, and continued, as if nothing had happened, pushing his torch toward them, as if trying to discover who they were. The whole room was astonished, and a blanket of silence enveloped the room for about a minute. The silence was broken only by a low, harsh, grating sound, much like the one heard when the wine was thrown into Petta's face. At this occasion, there was no mistaking where the sound came from. The small dwarf hung from the chain, his fang-like teeth grinding together, as he foamed at the mouth and glared, as if a maniac, at the upturned king and his 7 companions. The torch in the dwarf's hand came closer and closer to the king until it touched the flaxen costume he was in and lit him aflame. In less than half a minute, the 8 orangutans were blazing brightly, looked upon from below by the crowd of masqueraders, who let out horror-stricken shrieks and had no thought of assistance. Suddenly, the jester was forced to climb higher and higher on the chain as the flames grew and to be out of reach. The crowd grew silent once again, and he took his opportunity to speak.
I have now begun to see that this is the king and his 7 ministers. They so rudely treated my friend Trippetta. And I am Hop Frog, the jester, and this is my last jest.
The dwarf made an end to his brief speech as the high flammability of the flaxen tar of the costumes brought the work of revenge to an end. The 8 dead bodies swung on the end of the chain in a horribly looking group of black. The cripple threw his torch at the group and easily climbed to the ceiling and disappeared through the skylight. It is said that Trippetta was stationed on the roof of the saloon and had helped her friend in his rampage of revenge, and that, together, they made their escape to their own country, for neither was seen again.
Y'all ready for this?